From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, January 2nd, 2015. We'll start the new year with a look at the latest in the movement against police brutality, from Ferguson to New York to Los Angeles, Oakland, and beyond. And Victor Pickard will join us to discuss his new book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Christina. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights released its latest grim statistics on New Year's Day, tallying more than 76,000 people killed in Syria in 2014 alone. Of those, nearly 20,000 were civilians and more than 3,000 were children. Since 2011, when Syria's civil war began, more than 200,000 people have died. Syria's neighbor, Iraq, now shares with Syria the twin burdens of Islamic State militants and a U.S. war. The group Iraq Body Count released similar statistics, finding that more than 17,000 civilians had been killed in Iraq in 2014, double the number from the previous year. U.S. troops stationed in northern Iraq in a new war against the Islamic State have suffered no casualties. Well, Christina, these statistics are horrifying, but not getting very much attention in the U.S. media. Why?
Well, I think it's important to understand here that you have an issue of people not really caring about vulnerable bodies in this country. And so just as the issue that we have domestic about brown and black people's bodies not being cared about and protected, you see the same issue globally. But I also think it's important to note that U.S. foreign policy, and any time that we have to question U.S. foreign policy, and if we were to admit these statistics, we would have to question U.S. foreign policy. So anytime that we have to do that, you won't see mainstream media at least covering this issue.
Right. If it was in a different country or countries, we might see more coverage. Well, the next story is related to this. Italy's Coast Guard has rescued about 450 migrants aboard a ship that was abandoned in the middle of the Mediterranean. It was the second such rescue operation this week. On Wednesday, a boat carrying more than 800 migrants was found drifting on the sea. Many women and children were found on board both vessels. Italy's formal rescue program, called Mare Nostrum, had saved thousands of migrants' lives over the past year, but was brought to an end a few months ago due to high costs. There has been a huge surge in migration from Middle Eastern countries to southern European nations, like Italy and Greece, in recent years. The majority of the migrants are from Syria, Iraq, Libya, and other nations where war and violence has sharply increased. The EU has had a battle brewing over immigration, and like in the US, it now appears to have turned into a political issue between member states. Well, Christina, are there comparisons that we can draw between Europe's immigration problem and the US's? It sounds like crossing the Mediterranean is as dangerous, maybe more so, than crossing the US-Mexico border.
Sure. I think that there are definitely comparisons that we can make, and I think about, for instance, the huge migrations that happened in the 20th century from Central America and Mexico, and still continue today, but also do, again, from U.S. foreign policy. And so when I make these comparisons, I definitely want to connect the foreign policy issues, and maybe even thinking about, for instance, any kind of European intervention in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, and maybe looking at that as also another factor in the reason why these migrations continue. And of course, I mean, when it comes to immigration and migrations, this is a global issue, and violence is a global problem in any time people are crossing borders and seas. So there are definitely comparisons here to make, and some historical comparisons that are really important as well.
Right. And finally, a former New York governor, Mario Cuomo, has died at the age of 82. He had served as governor for 3 terms and passed away just hours after his own son, Andrew Cuomo, was inaugurated in the same position yesterday. Considered an icon of American liberalism, the elder Cuomo was the first Italian-American to become governor in the state. He oversaw New York during a contentious time in the U.S. at the height of the Reaganomics era. While he built more prisons than any other governor, he was also staunchly opposed to the death penalty. Despite his embrace of Catholicism, he was a supporter of abortion rights. Although he considered running for president many times, he never actually did run. According to the New York Times' eulogy, Mario Cuomo, quote, seemed to disdain politics even as he embraced it. What an ugly business this is, he liked to say, yet he reveled in it, proving himself an uncommonly skilled politician and sometimes a ruthless one. Well, Christina, what are your thoughts on Mr. Cuomo's legacy?
Well, Mr. Cuomo, like everyone else, proves that people are complicated. And so when we think about his legacy, I think it's important not to just celebrate his progressive policies and the economic reforms that he definitely was at the forefront of in New York. But I think it's also important, again, as you mentioned, the issue within prison industrial complex and expanding that system. So it's a complicated legacy, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and to admit that that is going to be his future, and we shouldn't skirt over any kind of negative impacts, but as well acknowledge definitely the positive contributions he made.
Well, Cristina Mislan, thank you so much for joining us. Cristina is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. She will be staying with us for the first half hour of our program when we come back from this short break. And by the way, before we go to break, a Happy New Year to all of you. I hope you have subscribed to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. We are on a roll into the next 1,000 subscribers that we hope to have in the next few months. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A very happy new year to you all. Just 2 days before Christmas, an 18-year-old African-American man named Antonio Martin was fatally shot by a white police officer just 5 miles from Ferguson, Missouri, in the town of Berkeley. The shooting occurred at a gas station after an altercation between Martin and an officer. Police say Martin was armed and pointed a gun at the officer, who remains unnamed. Like Ferguson, Berkeley, Missouri is a majority black city, but unlike Ferguson, its mayor, police chief, and a majority of officers are black, a fact that is being used to push back against ensuing protests. Meanwhile, in New York, where anger over Eric Garner's killing continues and where 2 NYPD officers were recently killed by a lone shooter, tensions between police and people has remained high. On New Year's Eve and day, there were several actions across the country protesting police brutality. In New York's Times Square, as well as on Boston's first night, protesters made their presence felt. In Southern California, there was a disruption of the Rose Parade as a small number of activists carried signs. There was also a concurrent occupation of the front of the LAPD headquarters. In St. Louis, activists occupied the St. Louis Police Department, and in Oakland, a number of people were arrested during protests. Joining us now is one of our regular news analysts, Cristina Mislan, assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. And on the phone with us is D. Desmond Robinson, presiding bishop of the Kingdom Destiny Fellowship International and senior pastor of Kingdom Dominion International Church in Belleville, Illinois, in the greater St. Louis area. Welcome to Uprising, Christina and Desmond.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello.
Christina, let me start with you. How important was it for activism to continue during this holiday season, despite the freezing cold weather across the country, despite the fact that this is normally a time when people might stop and spend time with their families or just take a break? People continue to show up in pretty significant numbers.
Well, it's really important. Not only is this a holiday where people spend time with their families and take a break from their everyday kind of lives, but it's also a holiday that is highly representative of capitalism and capitalist consumption. And so for people to have the spirit and endurance to go out and protest and continue to basically bring up the kind of systemic issues that people are confronting in this country. That's really important. As we know and as we've seen already, that people feel it when there are economic impacts. And so I think that's also very symbolic for what's going on as well.
And I want to turn to the bishop. And by the way, I should correct, his name is Desmond Robinson. Desmond, what about this latest killing in Berkeley, Missouri, which is a town very close to Ferguson, a majority black town like Ferguson? Antonio Martin, the young man that I mentioned who was killed, he was apparently being questioned by a cop regarding a robbery at a gas station. The mayor of Berkeley, Theodore Hoskins, said, "You can't even compare this with Ferguson or the Garner case in New York. We have the video, and I can assure you that what's on the video is what we're going to use." How do you respond to the justification of Martin's killing?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. I first believe that for the mayor to make that statement was ignorant on his case, simply because this is worse than a Michael Brown case, because the videos does not even show clearly that he had a gun. Only thing clearly that is shown is a cell phone that was being used by him. So I guess he can clearly say it cannot be compared, because for what he's doing and what he's trying to make this young man to be, such a criminal, I think is very disheartening.
And for our TV audience, let's watch the CCTV surveillance video. This version has been blown up so that it's more visible, and there does appear to be something in Martin's hand being pointed toward the cop. The cop in question fired 3 shots while Martin fired none. The video is quite blurry for our radio audience. It is a video that the police department released themselves. It is available online, and you can certainly see it for yourselves. Police do say that a 9mm gun was recovered at the scene, and it's a very interesting situation here, because we have it is a different sort of an altercation. There is some CCTV footage which the police are using, but the question is, how open is this to interpretation? While we keep this on our screens, Christina, what do you make of the fact that police are saying, here's the video and it's proving our point?
Well, I think first of all, just as was mentioned, is that this conversation really is about justifying a murder, a killing of a young black male. And so I think sometimes the questions about whether someone is armed or unarmed really dismisses the point here. We're talking about the surveillance of young black men in this country. We're also talking about issues of mass incarceration, police brutality. We're talking about systemic issues. So honestly, to me, the question that we're asking about whether he was armed or unarmed, or whether the video shows whether he has a gun or not, which I'm sure can be debated, it just dismisses these larger questions that we should be asking about the systemic issues, and not these individual cases of whether someone was armed and unarmed. Somebody was killed, right. And that's the important part.
And actually, Desmond, on that very issue, many activists, I understand, are bringing up the fact that that this young man was being questioned by police, had been repeatedly questioned by police, and this is part and parcel of the whole experience that young black men face in the United States with law enforcement, right?
Absolutely. I made a statement several months ago that every time a young black or brown African American leave his home, he's not guaranteed to come back, because the police, I almost have to say, literally feel that they have to compete against the people, which they're supposed to protect and serve us, not compete with us.
Now, let's turn to the fact that there has been a lot of not just activism from people who are part of this movement, but also pushback against activists by authorities. For example, a young activist named Joshua Williams, who is quite important in the scene in Ferguson, has been charged with arson and burglary. Another young activist named Rasheen Aldridge, who was so prominent that he was part of the commission or group of people that met with President Obama on this issue. He has been charged with assaulting a police officers. Christina, are these charges spurious?
You know, I think, yes, of course. Again, we're talking about anytime police say that they feel threatened, we don't really know what that means, how that's defined. And so we're talking about the same issue over and over again. And so whether it's a killing or it's someone getting arrested, I think the issue again goes back to this larger systemic issue of surveillance. And as Devon just mentioned, walking outside of your house has huge consequences. So anytime I hear cases where there's the justification for anything like this, I'm always skeptical initially from the beginning.
And I want to turn now to the fact that there is this divide, conversation that's happening within the Black community. Desmond, you, I understand, had something to say at Nelly's Black and White Ball that just took place a few days ago, where one of the musicians' responses, which has been sort of common among many elite sympathizers of the movement, one of Nelly's responses was to increase scholarships for Black youth. But isn't that an important approach to addressing issues of poverty, of joblessness? I understand that you didn't think it was enough.
Absolutely not, because when it's a scholarship for your school, it comes right back to you. So my concern, I had twofold concern. One concern is that there is something that we want to make sure that he's sowing back into the community that he does not reap from directly. That's when you're really sowing from your heart. And that's what our goal was. How can you sow back into the community and not per se reap directly from it? Of course, if, from biblically based that if you sow, you'll reap. But we're saying it as it relates to the natural sense from our community. And then number two, it was 2 weeks after Mike Brown, almost 3 weeks after Mike Brown was killed, before Nelly, who resides in this city, even came out and showing his sincerity to the people who have been his biggest supporters. And so the ball was not, there were scholarships given to people to attend his school, but that was not really a reach out to the real community.
And I understand that you and some others disrupted the ball?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely, made a major disturbance.
And did he respond? Did Nelly respond?
He sent his manager out to tell us he gave $1 million to the Mike Brown family, which we found that was not accurate completely.
Christina, on this issue of pushback that we discussed with Joshua Williams and Rasheen Aldridge, some are really worried about an issue that's might be even more worrisome than how ordinary people are interacting or able to push back through these various protests and die-ins with the police, and that is the kind of setting up of activists, the infiltration that has a long history in this country. A lot of folks have been raising the question of Assata Shakur, a Black liberation activist who has taken refuge in Cuba for many decades now, who during the height of the Black liberation movement and the militant aspect of the civil rights movement was, she says, framed by police for the killing of a New Jersey police officer. Is that example an important one?
Yes, of course. I think, when it comes to the issue of Assata Shakur, just like many of the other Black power activists and civil rights activists, and we're not just talking about historical figures like Huey P. Newton. We're also talking about historical figures like Martin Luther King, right? And so the FBI COINTEL program was really impactful on organizations within the Black Power movement, also what we would consider the kind of more mainstream nonviolent civil rights movement strand. But, you know, and so that continues, of course. I mean, we've seen that throughout the history of this country, and we will continue to. It's not that the 21st century is going to be any different. And I think, for instance, we can point to U.S. American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki, where the U.S. has continued to, and it's a completely different situation and case, but at the same time, the U.S. will continue, doesn't matter if you are a U.S. citizen or not, continue to surveil people, and people that the U.S. believes can have some sort of impact against the government and the system itself. So we definitely should be concerned.
And Desmond, are you also concerned about these things? Are these among the conversations that ordinary activists, that people on the ground, members of the movement that is really strengthening now, are they concerned about this as well?
Absolutely, because we don't, if it does not get rectified at this level, I think it's going to get worse. So it has been a major conversation that we've been dealing with at the ground roots level. To see how can we, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How do people protect themselves from it? Go ahead.
Well, that is a question that we're still trying to figure out. How do we protect ourselves? That's still a question that has been
And let me ask you this, Desmond, the New York City Police Department, going to that part of the country now where tensions between police and activists is, also extremely high, similar to in St. Louis. Police have been actively snubbing Mayor Bill de Blasio over what they say is his role in encouraging the killings of these two NYPD officers. There's been an interesting sort of informal work stoppage. People have noted that arrests by NYPD and other stops have dramatically decreased in the days following the killings of these two police officers. But isn't that exactly what protesters are fighting for? That the NYPD and the St. Louis Police Department, start to curb the number of people that they're arresting?
Absolutely. First, let me say, I know it really stemmed off an issue. He made a statement. Of course, Mayor de Blasio, his son is I tell people, if you look like you brown, they're going to treat you like you're brown. Okay. His son is a biracial, but because he has a small taste of African American in him, they consider him as a black individual. And so he doesn't walk around on his head with "I'm the mayor's son." But during the beginning of the protest, one of the police officers began to antagonize him. And so, of course, I think that just pushed the mayor into making the statement that he made and concerning the police. And so I think they got really angry with him for even standing up for his own son, right?
Now, in Los Angeles, where this program is produced, we have a little bit of an update on the shooting of the unarmed young African-American man, Iselle Ford, 25 years old, and there were major protests when he was first killed earlier last year. Coroner's autopsy of Ford found that he was shot 3 times. He was unarmed. The autopsy also found a muzzle imprint on a gunshot wound to Ford's back, suggesting that he might have been shot at close range. Police say they got in a scuffle with him when he was killed. Ford also suffered from a number of mental illness diagnoses. Christina, this sounds again like a very standard script, that somehow police are always getting into scuffles with young black men who reach for their guns or who threaten to kill them, and the police have to shoot them fatally in self-defense. How do you respond?
Well, yes, it is. It's a script, and it's a script that we continue to hear over and over, and we will continue to hear it. It's a script that won't change. Again, the conversation, the justifications that we hear when unarmed or armed, again, that part to me is less important. But although I understand why it's important to emphasize that this person was unarmed. But, instinctively, I automatically just am skeptical. I can't say that I don't. The story is hard when you're not present to have any kind of, I guess, evidence, if I want to use that word. But we should question, we should be skeptical, we should continue to ask questions about what actually happened. And also understand that, the actually might be the same as they were with Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, which means that we might not get any justice from this, unfortunately.
I want to turn finally back to Desmond. This emerging movement, this group of people that in Ferguson that have really been pushing others around the country, and their coordination and solidarity with folks in New York, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Chicago, so many other cities around the country. How heartened are you by what seems to be a persistence, a refusal to quiet down, a refusal to sit on the sidelines, that we are seeing finally a movement that's big and strong enough on an issue that's as old as the country itself, that the media are taking seriously, that politicians seem to be taking seriously, maybe not as seriously as we want, but how persistent is this?
I'm glad you asked that question. I think that you said, how serious is it? It is so serious to the point that people who I've never seen protest, people who've never got outside of their elements, meaning me, myself, and I, or the people I know, have got outside of their elements and have begun to stand firmly on what they believe. And I think that lets us know where we are and where we're going, to the sense of that it's who they become and what they've become. And I think that's what means the most to me, even in this creating this movement. I've really seen people emerge into what it's became. As I said before, people who would not normally protest, people who would not normally get outside of their environment have, really began to make a statement, which is I'm very proud.
And Christina, you're in Missouri as well. It's sort of an unlikely center of this movement. I think if we had to predict a year ago where the movement against police brutality and police violence would take hold, we probably wouldn't have picked Ferguson, right?
Yeah. I don't know. The killing of Michael Brown happened the weekend after I moved to Columbia, Missouri, and took the job as assistant professor in the journalism school at the university. And then when it happened, I immediately thought, wow, I am, in a moment in history, and this is important, and as sad as it was, it's also an important symbolic story that has become kind of the symbol for many of the stories and lived experiences of brown and black people in this country. And this is a conversation that has expanded to lots of different places, and places that we would have thought would have been the center. But I think places like Ferguson, right, just like we probably didn't think, in the 50s and 60s that cities like Selma and Montgomery would have been the spots. And so Ferguson is it's a moment in history. And so regardless if it's if it's Oakland or not, it's important. It's an important site of history now.
I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us today. Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at Missouri School of Journalism. On the phone with us, Desmond Robinson, Presiding Bishop of the Kingdom Destiny Fellowship International and Senior Pastor of Kingdom Dominion International Church in Belleville, Illinois, in the greater St. Louis area. He was one of many activists who disrupted Nelly's black and white ball during the holiday season. This is Uprising. Mumia Abu Jamal is whom we'll hear from next. He is a political prisoner and an award-winning journalist and also an important voice on this very same issue. He recently filed this commentary.
Demonstrating respect? Throughout much of modern American history, the season of mass demonstrations has been spring and summer. Look at old black and white photos of the anti-war, civil rights, and black power demonstrations of the 1960s and 70s, and you'll see people in T-shirts or simply dressed in shirts and jeans. The dress reflected the ease of the weather. Like in old military theory, the ground or terrain is important when planning battles. Now look at today. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people amass in biting cold, in wind, rain, and even snow. This is thus something new in social movements, perhaps enhanced by social media, but strengthened too by a deep sense that change must come to an intolerable situation, police violence against unarmed black men and boys. For at the heart of every meaningful movement of the 20th century has been the beating hearts of black people. And let's face it, black people aren't really fond of the cold. This should give us some sense of how deeply these issues resonate in black minds. Now, after the shootings of 2 cops in New York, come calls from politicians to suspend demos out of respect. The question arises, who respects whom? When cops killed Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and Tamir Rice, who showed respect for them? Brown was literally demonized by his killer. Garner, we were told, was too fat to survive his choking and should have just meekly submitted to the attack on him. Tamir, a child, was big for his age and scared cops, they said. Amazing. According to police bargaining unit head Patrick Lynch, Garner's killer was a model officer, an Eagle Scout, and just doing his job. Yeah, choking a man to death for suspicion of selling a cigarette. Real respectful, huh? Oh, by the way, the verb lynch comes from, we are informed by anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells, Pittsylvania County, Virginia, around 1780, when a Colonel William Lynch instituted hangings for horse thieves. A crusading journalist, Ida B. Wells, would be amazed at how easily blacks could be killed in the 21st century by police without due process. Her keen eye would survey New York, Cleveland, Ferguson, and beyond, and perhaps she would recognize modern-day lynch law. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, is expected to unveil his decision on the crucial issue of net neutrality within the next few weeks. The decision is fraught with controversy after Wheeler proposed a 2-tier system last year that would create an unequal playing field on the internet, provoking outrage from consumers and corporations. Today's media is dominated by online consumption. We turn to the internet for our print news, to watch talk shows, to enjoy television and film, post photos, tweet our opinions, and in general communicate with one another. But our online media landscape, like traditional media, is increasingly dominated by large corporate entities that have often banked on notions of internet freedom in order to be free to profit. Well, how did things get the way they are today? It turns out we have to dig quite deep within our history all the way to the 1940s to determine political decisions and turning points that led to our present-day system, and to make the case that it is not a natural or predetermined outcome. My guest is Victor Pickard, assistant professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of the new book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. Welcome to Uprising, Victor.
Thank you, Sonali. Good to be here.
Well, where was American media in the 1940s? Obviously, most of us weren't, or many of us weren't around at that time. What was the dominant medium of choice?
So the dominant medium at that time in the 1940s was commercial radio. And at this time, you had basically the majority of the radio landscape dominated by two major companies, NBC and CBS. And you also had an FCC at this time that was trying to decide how to best regulate this still relatively new medium, how to decide what is the role of media in a democratic society. And there were a lot of debates that are somewhat familiar to us today that were taking place in the 40s.
So would you say that radio, in a way, was as revolutionizing to people's ability to communicate and to hear the news as internet is today?
Absolutely. You heard a lot of the same kind of rhetoric that you hear today about the potential for this new medium to revolutionize society, to democratize society, to give voice to the voiceless. Things that we're very familiar with today that we often hear about with regards to the internet.
Right. And we should say, actually, that Pacifica Radio, where this network, where this radio station that we're broadcasting from was born, came out of that same radio revolution and out of the kind of discomfort that people started to feel, that I want to turn to in a minute, around the corporatization of radio. How crucial, actually, let's step back first, how crucial was this notion that the airwaves, that the frequencies that radio stations still broadcast on in terms of traditional radio, that those belong to the public and that private entities had to lease them from the public, to borrow them in order to communicate to us? That is an important concept, but we take it for granted.
You're absolutely right. Today we hear that. Sometimes it might sound like a slogan that came out of the 60s, but it's very much true. And even back in the 1940s, this was a kind of rallying cry for various media reform groups who kept reminding everyone that the air belongs to the people. And this is something that, when you think about it, that these private companies are able to lease essentially for free and then make tremendous amounts of profit from these public airwaves. It's a core contradiction, and it helped motivate a very vibrant media reform movement in the 1940s.
In many ways, it's part of our commons, as we call it, and there are major battles being fought over literally things like air and water in other sectors of society. So if the public owns the airwaves and have simply been renting them out to these private entities, what are the public getting in return? And what were the public getting in return in the 1940s? Aren't media entities, and weren't they even back then, supposed to apply for renewals every few years to be able to justify in some way the use they were making of the public's property?
You're absolutely correct. And the way that I tried to think of this, what was happening in the 1940s was essentially a social contract that was being fought over, and basically trying to decide, what do these commercial entities owe society in return? What are their public service responsibilities? And at that time in the 40s, there was a lot of concern. There was a growing outrage, if you will, about how little society was getting in return from these commercial broadcasters. And you saw this play out among various social movement groups. You saw the FCC intervene and try to create more meaningful public interest obligations. I don't think we need to keep anyone in suspense about how this all worked out. As we know today, commercial broadcasters almost face no viable threat of ever losing their license to the public airwaves. But in the 40s, this was still open-ended, and this is essentially what was being fought over.
And so how did radio, commercial radio, sustain itself in the 1940s? Today we know that for, every 10 minutes of content we might hear, there might be several minutes of advertising. Is that how it was done back then?
Yes, that was basically the business model even way back then in the 40s. And in fact, what you saw was this public reaction to increasing radio advertisements that were interrupting various programs. In fact, people had words of contempt for them. They called them plug uglies, and singing jingles that the public was often enraged about, that these inane advertisements were coming onto the air, and they felt that they were very invasive. I think we've become very desensitized to them today, but at that time it was highly contentious.
You mentioned the FCC, and this is an entity that we still very much pay attention to in our current political system. These days, the issue of net neutrality is big on the FCC's radar, but where did the FCC come from? And how did the FCC attempt to protect the public's interest in the 40s at the peak of radio as a privately owned medium?
Yes,
privately released medium, I should say.
Yes. In fact, the Federal Communications Commission was established with the 1934 Communications Act, and essentially they had telecommunications, broadcast media, much of our media system, although not newspapers, fall under their purview. But up until the 1940s, even as the New Deal project was establishing itself throughout much of government, which tended to be very anti-monopoly, it wasn't until the early 40s that this kind of mindset, this New Deal agenda, reached the FCC. And that's why, even as when you see the New Deal in various stages of retreat throughout much of the American government in the early 40s, at the FCC it arrived later and stayed longer than elsewhere. And that's why you see, interestingly, this sort of peak in media reform activity, both among social movement groups, but especially at the FCC as well in the mid to late 1940s.
So then how did the media reform movement back then, what were its demands, and what were, we know now how the story ended, but what were the decisions, the political decisions taken at the time that enabled our current media system today in a way that permeates almost every aspect of how we consume media?
Yes, so there were a number of demands. I think, again, going back to this idea that the air belongs to the people, that radio is ours, that the media system is our media system, and it plays a very special role within a democratic society. Excuse me. So there was this kind of normative, what academics refer to as normative, what media ought to do, what is their special role in a democracy. This sort of overarching framework was very clear. But in addition to that, you saw various social movement groups, especially African-American groups, labor unions, who realized that they were being misrepresented in media. It was very clear to them that in order to advance their issue, they had to negotiate with this commercial media system. And the second realization was that in order to change the media system, they had to engage with media policy. So you saw this kind of media policy reform movement emerge in the 1940s.
And I should say, this is something we just never hear about. I mean, we understand the media reform movement today, particularly those of us who follow it. But in the 1940s, there's very little sense that there was pushback from the public in a serious way against how corporations were taking over our system of media. Tell us, going back to the FCC and its attempt to protect the public, you have a section in your book that focuses on the Blue Book of the FCC, what you call, quote, one of the FCC's most progressive initiatives ever attempted. What is the Blue Book? Why is it so little known?
Right, it has been almost entirely forgotten in our history, but at the time it was a very dramatic intervention where, in response to this growing media reform movement, in response to these social pressures that the FCC was feeling, they felt that they had to define what the public interest meant. And they had to define it in a way that was very clear for what commercial broadcasters had to do in order to deliver on their public service responsibilities to the public. And so this book, it was called the Blue Book because of its blue cover. It was called the Public Service Responsibilities of Broadcast Licensees. And essentially, for commercial broadcasters to keep their licenses, they would have to deliver on certain public interest obligations, like, for example, cover a particular amount of public affairs, local culture, educational content. They also had to devote hours of programming to non-commercial programs, so programs that weren't being sponsored by things like soap, by entities like soap companies. That's where we got the term soap operas, because they were sponsored by these companies. And it was basically clear that if broadcasters did not deliver on these responsibilities, that would trigger public hearings, and presumably they would lose their licenses, which again is an almost unthinkable act in today's context. But at the time, commercial broadcasters had real reason to fear that the FCC would deliver on these proposals, and the public was very much behind the FCC at this time.
And this, we consider this quite radical, but at that time, when the FCC came out with this blue book, was it really radical, or was it a sort of weakened version of what the public would have liked to see?
That's a great question. So yes and no. So yes, it was radical in the sense that if broadcasters, again, were not to deliver on these public service responsibilities, they would lose their licenses. And that was a pretty radical move for the FCC at that time, although it was couched in, I mean, it was a very reasonable proposal. It wasn't like they were asking broadcasters to completely decommercialize their programming, although this is what broadcasters feared might happen ultimately. But on the other hand, it was not radical in the sense that it was kind of already a retreat from earlier structural interventions, which the FCC initially tried to do in the early 40s, where they actually trust busted. I mean, they broke up NBC. They forced NBC to divest one of its major networks, which then became ABC. And they did other things like tried to make it more difficult for newspapers to buy radio stations, which they were quickly acquiring. So they had gone from these more structural interventions to then focusing more on programming content. And I think that's part of this larger trajectory that you see where the FCC initially tried to really remake the structures of our media system to then trying to accommodate this commercial system.
Right.
And by the end of the 40s, you have the Fairness Doctrine, which was kind of the last gasp.
So let's talk about that. The Fairness Doctrine is defined as the doctrine that imposes affirmative responsibilities on a broadcaster to provide coverage of issues of public importance that is adequately and fairly reflecting differing viewpoints. In fulfilling its Fairness Doctrine obligations, a broadcaster must provide free time for the presentation of opposing views if a paid sponsor is unavailable, and must initiate programming on public issues if no one else seeks to do so. So essentially, this is more about an appearance of balance rather than an obligation to fulfill some basic requirement for the public, right?
That is true. And in this broader context in the 1940s, the Fairness Doctrine, and at the time it only later became known as the Fairness Doctrine, but in 1949 when this was passed, it again was seen as sort of a consolation prize to media reform activists who had really been organizing for much more strict and structural regulations. I don't want to, I mean, it is a little bit complicated because, of course, we know that the Fairness Doctrine was used by activists for decades until 1987 when the Reagan FCC revoked it. So I don't want to suggest that it was meaningless, but today it's often held up as the high watermark for progressive media policymaking, when in fact, in the 40s, it was part of this longer retreat. It was also taking place in the context of red baiting, which is really what defeated the FCC's Blue Book proposals, that industry was seeing any kind of regulation, no matter how light or reasonable, as some kind of socialist communist plot. And many of the reformers at that time were red-baited and ultimately chased out of Washington, D.C.
And so then is that the main reason why we have a media system today in the United States that, unlike other countries where there is a much stronger state-owned media system, here in the U.S. our state-owned or funded, I should say, media are very, very small. There is no such thing as state-owned media. We get very, very small amounts, minuscule amounts of funding from the government for entities like this one and primarily PBS, NPR, et cetera. And even those are being threatened constantly by conservatives. Is the red baiting of the McCarthyism of the 40s and 50s what ultimately led to our situation today?
Yes, I think what we have today is part of that legacy. I would be careful not to suggest that everything can be traced back to those decisions in the 1940s, but I do see the origins of this kind of ideological project that basically assumed that any kind of government intervention into the market in general, but media markets specifically, as illegitimate, as some kind of socialist takeover. We're very much dealing with the aftermath even today, 70 years later. So yes, that's the simple answer to that question is yes.
Now, we talked a lot about radio, which was at its peak in the 1940s, really revolutionized communication. But what about the newspaper industry, the sort of the industry that predated radio and the industry that maybe surprisingly is still existing today, albeit struggling?
That's right. And interestingly, again, a lot of parallels with the 1940s, which at that time was experiencing a kind of newspaper industry crisis. You had a lot of concerns about the rise of one newspaper towns, newspaper monopolies, newspaper chains. You had a lot of concerns that a commercial press could not deliver on all of democratic society's communication requirements. Although very important differences, because today you have the advertising model, the advertising business model completely imploded, that was still functioning in the 1940s, but you had a lot of concern about its excesses, and I think many of the things we take for granted today about the role of the press in a democratic society were still somewhat open-ended and still being negotiated in the 1940s.
And so what lessons can activists who are attempting to keep the internet, the domain of people, ordinary people, what lessons can activists learn from the 1940s, both positive lessons and lessons of what not to repeat?
Yes, that's a great question, and that's what I'm trying to address with my book, because there are a number of cautionary tales that can be drawn from these 1940s policy battles. I think beyond the realization that the system we have today was not inevitable, I think that what we need to take away from the 1940s is that whenever we leave a key media infrastructure, in the 40s it was commercial broadcasting, today it's the internet, whenever we leave this to the mercies of the market and we think that that we shouldn't regulate it, it leads us into a dangerous predicament where we no longer, as a public, have control over these key communication infrastructures.
And we should really clarify that we are seeing attempts at regulating, but in the favor of corporations, right? And that's what Tom Wheeler has proposed, and of course that's what major telecom companies would like to see. And when we see pushback from big companies like Google in favor of net neutrality, is it this corporate libertarianism at work here? Because they realize that regulations favoring some corporations would impact them. And so should we, as a movement for media reform, really be asking for regulations that favor ordinary people over the likes of both Charter and Google?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think we see that. We can take that lesson home from the 1940s when, similarly, although the FCC of the 1940s was at least putting up a fight, but ultimately they fell back on kind of halfway measures where they tried to regulate in a way that would not create any sort of meaningful public interest obligations, would not interfere with corporations' profit motives in any significant way. And so in many ways, yes, history is repeating itself today, unfortunately.
And so then how would you, what are the cautionary tales that you would suggest to people in terms of how they approach the FCC, which is still apparently the primary political vehicle through which people can try to address change? I mean, this is a very small commission of appointed politicians, essentially, depending upon which party is in power in the White House. You can have 3 votes one way, 3 another way.
That's absolutely correct. And although in the 1940s there were actually 7 commissioners as opposed to the 5 that we have today, similarly, in fact, in some ways it's a better situation today in that there are more avenues through which the public can pressure the FCC compared to the 1940s. So I think that we can see historically that the FCC does respond to public pressures, but unfortunately as this kind of corporate libertarian paradigm has taken hold, the FCC often operates in what many people refer to as a captured regulatory agency, in that it has sort of internalized the logics and the value systems of the industries it purportedly regulates. So in many ways it's not responsive to these public pressures, but I think we have to learn from history, from what's happening today, that activists of all kinds, of all issues, ignore media policy at their own peril.
Right. I mean, if the internet goes the way of radio and television, we will be in trouble. This program and others like it on Pacifica Radio and Free Speech TV are just teeny tiny slivers in a landscape just utterly dominated by media giants, and we see the repercussions on our political debates similarly. I'm guessing you would agree with that sentiment.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment, but I also don't think we should end on too much of a depressing note, because I think as you look around, I mean, just what happened over the summer with nearly 4 million people responding to the FCC's open internet rules, or their proposed rules, you see that people are engaging, people are becoming increasingly aware of how important this is, of how high the stakes are around issues like net neutrality. And I also think that even as this market fundamentalism, this corporate libertarianism is still very much entrenched, especially in Washington, D.C., you're seeing it be challenged in many ways as well.
Well, Victor Pickard, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and putting some historical context to this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonali. I enjoyed it.
My guest, Victor Pickard, is an assistant professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and we've been discussing his book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.